The winter of 1945 did not merely bring snow to the Eifel region. It brought a cold so profound that it seemed to freeze the very flow of time. Bitburg was no longer a town of bakers, brewers, and families. It was a skeletal monument to the vanity of empires. The air was a thick, choking mixture of pulverized limestone, the metallic tang of spent shell casings, and the sickly sweet smell of decay that even the frost could not entirely mask. For Marta Schmidt, a woman of 44 who had seen her husband Hans march away into the shimmering heat of the 1941 summer, only to vanish into the white silence of Russia, the war had become a personal, claustrophobic haunting. Marta lived in the cellar of what was once the Schmidt Bäckerei. The upper 3 floors, the living room with the piano, the kitchen that always smelled of caraway seeds, and the bedroom where she had spent 20 years of peaceful nights, had been sheared away by an Allied blockbuster bomb in November. Now, her world was a rectangle of damp stone, lit only by a flickering iron stove and a single high window that looked out onto the charred remains of the street. On a Tuesday morning, driven by the primitive necessity of survival, Marta ventured out. The fog was a gray shroud, clinging to the jagged ruins like a living thing. She moved toward the forest on the town's edge, hoping to find wood that wasn't too wet to burn. Every step was a gamble. The Gestapo was increasingly erratic, looking for defeatists to hang from the few remaining lampposts to encourage the others. She found the soldier near a stand of blackened fir trees. He was slumped against a trunk, his olive-drab uniform nearly gray with frost. At first she thought he was a corpse, but then she saw the rhythmic puff of white breath. He was young, painfully young, with a face that reminded her of the apprentices Hans used to train. Corporal James Miller was a man who had lost his war. Separated from his scout unit during the Ardennes counteroffensive, he had been wandering for 48 hours, his feet having long since lost sensation. When she stepped on a dry branch, the snap was like a gunshot in the frozen silence. James flinched, his eyes snapping open. They were bloodshot and frantic. He fumbled for his M1 Garand, his fingers so stiff they looked like wooden claws. "Please," Marta said, her voice a raspy whisper. She raised her hands, palms open. She searched the depths of her memory for the English she had learned in Frankfurt as a girl. "Do not shoot. I am alone. No soldiers. Only me." James stared at her. In his mind, he had been prepared to kill a Kraut soldier, a fanatic SS officer, or a sniper. He was not prepared for this woman, a widow in a tattered coat who looked like the personification of grief. The barrel of the rifle wavered and then dropped. He let out a sound that was half sob, half cough. "Food?" he croaked. "Water. Help me." Marta looked at the woods behind him. If she left him, he would freeze by nightfall. If she brought him back, she was inviting the executioner into her home. But she looked at his eyes, the same shade of blue as Hans's, and she knew she could not leave him. "Follow," she commanded. "Stay low. If you see gray uniforms, you hide." The journey back to the cellar was a slow-motion nightmare. They moved through the shadows of the ruins, dodging a patrol of the Volkssturm, old men and boys with rifles too big for them. When they finally descended the stairs into the cellar, the heat from the stove hit James like a physical blow, and he collapsed onto the dirt floor. Marta didn't waste time. She was a baker. She knew how to handle dough, how to heal things with heat and patience. She pulled off his boots. The socks were frozen to his skin, and began the agonizing process of thawing his feet with lukewarm water. "You are American," she stated, not as a question. "Ohio," he whispered. "Cleveland." "My name is James." "Here you have no name," Marta said sharply. "Here you are a ghost, and ghosts must be quiet." She fed him a thin gruel made of turnips and a few scraps of salt pork. It was the best meal he had eaten in weeks. But as he reached for a second bowl, the sound they both dreaded vibrated through the floorboards above. The heavy rhythmic thud of hobnailed boots, the sound of authority, the sound of the Gestapo. "Patrol!" Marta hissed. Her face went the color of a guttering candle. "They check for deserters. If they find you, they kill us both. They will hang me in the square." James reached for his rifle, but Marta kicked it under the coal heap. "No! If you shoot, they bring a tank. You listen to me." She grabbed a heavy gray wool sweater from a trunk. Hans's sweater, thick and smelling of cedar and old time. "Take off the jacket. Put this on. Now." As James stripped his American field jacket, Marta threw him onto the cot. "You are my husband, Hans. You have just come back from the Russian front. You are wounded in the head. You cannot speak. You cannot think. You just stare at the fire. Do you understand? Your life depends on your silence." The cellar door was kicked open. 2 men descended. One was a young SS Obersturmführer with a face as sharp as a razor, and eyes that saw only treason. The other was an older Wehrmacht sergeant, a man who looked like he had seen enough death to last 10 lifetimes. "Frau Schmidt," the young officer said, his flashlight beam dancing across the room until it landed on James. "Who is this?" Marta stood between them and the cot, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would crack her ribs. "My husband, Hans. He returned 4 days ago. He was at the siege of Budapest." The officer stepped closer, the light blinding James. James did exactly as he was told. He stared into the glowing embers of the stove, his face a mask of vacant, hollow-eyed exhaustion. He didn't blink. He looked like a man whose soul had been burned out of him. "He has no papers," the officer noted, his hand resting on his pistol. "The convoy was hit by Yabos outside of Dresden." Marta lied, her voice gaining a strange, defiant strength. "Everything was lost. He walked home. Look at his feet. They are black with frost. Would you take a man who cannot even stand and put him in a cell? He has given everything for the fatherland. Now he only wants to sit by his wife's fire." The older sergeant looked at the gray sweater, then at James's vacant stare. He sighed. "My brother is the same. He came back from Stalingrad. He sits in the garden and talks to people who aren't there. It is the Zittern." The SS officer lingered, his suspicion like a cold draft. He looked at James's hands. They weren't the hands of an old man, but they were scarred and dirty. Finally, he spat on the floor. "The war is full of ghosts. Keep him inside. If the Americans come, they will treat him as a combatant if they see him on the street." When the door finally closed and the truck moved away, the silence in the cellar was so thick it felt like water. James let out a breath that sounded like a scream held in for years. "You saved me," he whispered. "I saved myself," Marta replied, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Now, you are Hans. For as long as the Germans hold this street, you are my husband." For the next 3 days, time ceased to exist in the traditional sense. There was only the cycle of the stove, the meager meals, and the terrifying sounds of the world dying above them. James could not leave the cellar. He could not even stand near the high window during the day. To keep from going mad, they fell into a routine. James, feeling the need to earn his life, used his physical strength to repair the cellar. He moved heavy foundation stones that had been shifted by the bombings, shoring up the ceiling. Marta watched him work, seeing the ghost of Hans in the way James moved, the way he squared his shoulders. They began to talk in low whispers during the long nights. James told her about the life he had left behind. He told her about the hardware store his father owned, the smell of sawdust and oil. He told her about Sarah, his fiancée, who worked at the local library and had promised to marry him the day he came home. "She has a dress made of silk," James said, his eyes distant. "She bought it with her first paycheck. She says it's the color of a summer sky." Marta listened, her hands busy mending a pair of Hans's old trousers for James to wear. "The world in Ohio sounds like a dream, James. Here, the sky is only ever gray or red. We used to have dreams too." Hans wanted to buy a bigger oven. He wanted to make the best Schwarzbrot in the Rhineland. "He was a good man?" James asked. "He was a man who loved the smell of flour," Marta said. "He hated the uniforms. He hated the shouting. When they took him, he looked at me and said, 'Marta, don't let the fire go out.' I think he knew." On the second night, James found a small piece of wood in the coal pile. Using a small pocket knife he had hidden, he began to carve. He worked with the focus of a man trying to carve his way out of a nightmare. By the next morning, he had created a small, primitive bird, a lark. "For you," he said, handing it to Marta. "A piece of Ohio wood. Or German wood, I guess. But a lark is a lark everywhere." Marta held the small object, her thumb tracing the wings. It was the first gift she had received in years that wasn't a ration card or a piece of bad news. "Thank you, Hans," she said, the name slipping out naturally. James didn't correct her. In that cellar, the boundary between their identities was dissolving. He was the protector she had lost. She was the mercy he had never expected to find. The third night brought the end of the world. The American artillery had moved within range of the town center. The barrage was relentless. Every few seconds the earth would heave, and the cellar would fill with the choking dust of centuries-old mortar. Marta, who had been so strong, finally broke. As a shell landed directly across the street, collapsing the remains of the neighboring house, she curled into a ball in the corner, her hands over her ears, screaming silently. The trauma of 3 years of bombardment, of the loss of her husband, and of the weight of the lie she was carrying finally crushed her. James didn't hesitate. He crawled across the dirt floor and pulled her into his arms. He wrapped the heavy gray sweater around them both. He held her head against his chest so she wouldn't hear the screams of the shells. "I've got you," he shouted over the roar. "I'm here, Marta. Hans is here. We aren't going anywhere." He stayed like that for 6 hours. He became the wall she needed. He became the anchor in the storm. In those hours, he wasn't a corporal in the U.S. Army. He was the husband she had been denied. He felt her tears soak through the wool of the sweater, and he realized that his life had been spared for this specific moment, not to kill, but to hold. When the sun rose on the 4th day, the silence was different. It wasn't the frozen silence of the Gestapo. It was the humming, mechanical silence of an advancing army. The clatter of tank treads, heavy, rhythmic, and unmistakably American, filled the street. James stood up. He looked at his American uniform, still hidden under the coal. He looked at Marta, who was pale but calm. "They are here," he said. He put on his field jacket and grabbed his rifle. The transition was painful. He was becoming Corporal Miller again, a cog in the great machine of war, but he kept the gray sweater on underneath. "You must go," Marta said. Her voice was flat, the voice of a woman who had already said her goodbyes. "If they find you with me, they will think I am a prisoner. Go to your people." James stopped at the stairs. He took his silver lighter, a gift from his father, and placed it on the table. "Trade this for food. It's real silver. And this—" He handed her a scrap of paper with his address in Cleveland. "If you ever can, write to me. Tell me you are alive." Marta took the paper, but she didn't look at it. She looked at him. "Goodbye, James from Ohio. Goodbye, Marta of Bitburg." James stepped out into the light. The American soldiers who found him were stunned. They saw a man in a U.S. uniform carrying an M1 Garand, emerging from a hole in the ground like a ghost. There was a moment of tension, then a roar of recognition. "Miller! You lucky son of a bitch! We had you down as KIA." James allowed himself to be swept up. He was fed, he was debriefed, and he was sent back into the line. He never told them about the woman. He never told them about the gray sweater he wore under his fatigues until the day the war ended. 40 years passed. The world moved on from the ashes of 1945. James Miller lived the life he had promised. He married Sarah, he ran the hardware store, and he grew old in the quiet suburbs of Cleveland. But he never forgot the smell of that cellar or the woman who had lied to save a stranger. In 1985, after Sarah had passed away, James returned to Bitburg. The town was unrecognizable, a beautiful modern German city with parks and glass-fronted shops. He found the site of the bakery. It was now a small park with a commemorative plaque for the civilians who had died in the bombings. As he sat on a bench, an elderly woman approached, pushing a stroller with a small child. She sat on the other end of the bench and began to hum a tune. The same tune Marta used to hum in the dark. James felt a jolt in his chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, weathered wooden lark. He held it out in his palm. The woman stopped humming. Her eyes, still hard but soft when worried, fixed on the bird. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small silver lighter, its surface scratched and dull from decades of use. They didn't speak for a long time. There was no need. The lie they had lived for 3 days in 1945 had been the only truth that mattered. James took her hand, the hand of the woman who had been his wife when the world was ending, and together they watched the sun set over a town that was no longer a skeleton, but a home. "You kept the bird," he whispered. "And you kept the sweater," she replied, noticing the gray wool peeking from under his coat. In the end, the war had taken much, but it had failed to take the one thing that truly mattered, the bread of mercy that two strangers had shared in the dark.